Hi, Gabriel. It's really good to see you again, and it's good to meet up, even if we're meeting up at opposite sides of the Atlantic in this technology that we've all had to get used to over the last year or so. And I was thinking, the last time we were actually together, the last time we met at around the turn of the year, the dark time of the year was about 10 or 11 years ago, when I was still in New York working at the consulate. And we both drove up together to a memorial service for Donald Donnelly. And I think it was held in Connecticut. I mean, he had died shortly after Christmas. And I remember in the car journey, we were talking about all of the roles that Donald Donnelly had played, because he'd actually, I suppose he'd preceded you out to the States and into a very different career in acting in the US, because he'd started off with Ennio McMaster and then kind of worked his way through The Gate and then out to Broadway. But we were talking about his role as Freddie Malins, that really memorable role in The Dead, and how much that story is really a story about those who aren't there. That great story by James Joyce. And I thought of that immediately, Gabriel, when I started reading your memoir, Walking with Ghosts, and it just struck me how much that book is about people who are not there. In a way, people who still live with you, who are still very present with you. But it's a very tender, authentic memoir about your father and your mother and your sister. And it made me think, in a way, that sometimes I think we feel those absences more keenly at this time of the year, or maybe we feel their presence more keenly at this time of the year. Would that be your impression?
Yes. Well, the title itself came from a moment many years ago when I was doing a famine commemorative walk in County Mayo, and it was, I suppose, introduced as we all stood there waiting to start the walk. An Indian, a representative of the Choctaw tribe, a man called Gary Whitedeer, told that, which is now a kind of famous story about how the Irish and the Choctaw Indians met during the Trail of Tears, and the Irish people gave what money they had to the Choctaw Indians because they were on their Trail of Tears, and they were famine refugees themselves. And the Choctaw Indians never forgot that. And before we started to walk, he said, it's a long walk. It's going to be eight or 9 miles. But he said, you must remember this, that as you walk along, the spirits of your ancestors will be walking with you on that road. And he outlined what a powerful belief that was among the Choctaw Indians, something I had never thought before. It made me think about the idea of memory and imagination and celebration. It also made me think about absence and what absence actually is. In the book, I don't think there's anybody I mentioned who's still alive. And it was an attempt to reconcile those who have gone with my own experience in the world today. But it's not just about the people who have gone, because I used to think when I was a kid that being haunted was a terrible thing. But actually the presence of people in one's life can be a tremendously comforting thing. And I find that when I think of my father, for example, who I listened to for many, many years, but never heard until he was gone, and my mother, and the wisdom that they imparted to me, the guides that they were setting down for me in life that I didn't pay much attention to, I realized they're still very much with me. And also, I think that the landscapes that are gone too, which I also talk about in the book. Landscapes can haunt you, and when I say haunt, I mean in the most benign way. That scene at the end of The Dead is a beautiful scene where he talks about snow is general all over Ireland. The metaphor for snow is a particularly powerful and beautiful one, because each individual snowflake is unique to itself, and yet it's part of an entire collection that descends as one thing, it seems. It's beautiful, and yet it's absolutely impermanent. And when he says that line, it falls on all the living and the dead, he's including the living and the dead in that sentence. And I think the dead are still in many ways very much living with us in terms of our memory and our imagination too. So yes, it was an attempt to reconcile the past with the present.
You know, that reminds me of another conversation we had about, I remember talking to you about Evan Boland's poem, A Lost Atlantis, because she wrote this, and there's another loss this year, actually, when you begin to count them up and when you begin to think about them. But, you know, and that's a poem that she wrote to a Dublin that's no longer there. And, you know, she relates that memory of Dublin back to the Greek myth about the city that has been lost and submerged. And she says, I miss our old city, white pepper, white pudding, you and I meeting under fan lights and low skies to go home in it. Maybe what really happened is this: the old fable makers searched hard for a word to convey that what is gone forever, and never found it. And so in the best traditions of where we come from, they gave their sorrow a name and drowned it. And, you know, I find it very moving, you know, when you're walking the landscape of your childhood. You know, you talk about crossing a 4-lane highway somewhere and seeing some kids being stopped by the guards and held up against the car, and seeing through that, you know, seeing through that present time, the people who used to live, the shops, you know, that were there in that area, butcher, the chemist, the barber, and the people who used to live there. And it is really amazing how quickly our world, the world that we grew up in, you know, has become physically different. Not just that the people are no longer there, but it's physically different. I mean, do you still see or recognize any of that Dublin when you come home?
Well, I think the experience of the emigrant or the exile or the immigrant or whatever you want to call a person who is displaced, because when you are any one of those things, you are displaced. Your relationship to the home country changes. So when you return, you're looking for something that people who don't leave there are not looking for. One of the first things that happens to you when you leave Ireland is that you're identified as being Irish. You don't have to identify yourself as Irish when you're in Ireland. You don't turn to somebody and say, geez, I didn't know you were Irish. Where are you from, Kilkenny? We're Irish. But when you step outside that, you immediately have a different identity. So when you return, you're bringing back that fractured identity to a sense of the past and a sense of the present. So you look for pieces of yourself in the landscape. And there's a sort of a sadness about the landscape that you remember disappearing before your eyes, because we like to think that we have ownership over landscape. We like to think, why did they build that on that field there? That was a lovely field with a lovely. No, that will soon not be a memory for anybody. It'll be the memory of the people who are living in that block of flats who look out. When we come to the idea of home, what home is a very conflicted notion for the immigrant. Where is home? You come back looking for home, but you realize with a certain amount of sadness that home does not belong to you, nor does landscape, nor does the city, nor even the people. What you have is your memory, and your memory is precious to you, but it is only to you. So when you come back, like one of the most powerful Irish myths, I think we've discussed this many times, Niall, I don't know if you remember, one of the most potent Irish myths is the story of Oisin and Tiernan Og, where he goes away and he goes to this land, Tiernan Og, forever young, and he misses his friends and his companions and the hunting and Hoth, and he asks Niamh Kino, can I go back just to visit? Because she recognizes the restlessness in him, and she says to him, yes, but you can't put your foot on the soil of Ireland. It's a very powerful myth because it's also connected in the Bible to Lot's wife. When God says to Job, or not Job, Lot, get out of the city, and one thing you must do is not look back at it. And Lot's wife can't resist the urge to look back, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. Oisin can't resist lifting that rock to help those men, and his spirit dies. The message in those myths is you cannot return. That's what that's really about. And there is no such thing as the absolute connection between the past and the present. So home doesn't belong to us. A little later in that opening thing, I talk about coming down to the house where we used to live. And there was 8 of us in that small house. And I stood outside looking at it and thinking, all the things that happened in that house, all the drama, all the sadness, all the joy, all the Friday nights, the Saturday nights, was contained in that house as I stood looking at it as a grown man. And as I was looking at it, the door opened and a stranger came out of our house. And the door was open just a crack, and behind him I saw the extension that had now taken the place of our kitchen. Because in my dreams, in my imagination, when I look back through that door, our kitchen is still there with 8 of us sitting around a table. And when I looked through that crack, there was an extension. And my first thought was, they put in an extension in our kitchen. The man came out and he looked at me somewhat suspiciously. And he said, what do you want? And I said, nothing. I'm just looking. I used to live here. And I realized home, that home does not belong to me anymore. It's that man's home. And I was an intruder in my own past. And I think that's the sense that people have when they come back to look for home. When you go through the streets of Dublin, what Ivan Boland is talking about there is a world that's gone, a world that can never be recovered. The past can never be recovered, just like the future can never really be brought forward. We must live perforce in the present. But when I come back, every doorway in Dublin that's there, every stairway, every pub is filled with ghosts. Oh, that's where that used to be. And that's where Sinnett's was before they knocked it down. And there was a barber shop there and so forth. So that landscape is a landscape that exists only in my memory. And it only belongs to me in my memory. And it reminds me of a time I was in Africa and I was walking, we were in the bush and on a kind of a main road that went through this ancient bushland, there was the body of some kind of animal. and it had been killed by a car, and it lay there on this tarmacadam road through the bush. And I took a photograph of it because something about it struck me, but I didn't know what it was until later. And I realized that animal was killed crossing a road that we had made, and we had put the road through his land. And rather than people are saying, oh my God, what was that animal doing running across the road? No, we were running across his road. So what I'm saying is that what belongs to us is an illusion. Nothing really truly belongs to us, including the past, including home and the landscapes that we have grown to love. Because when we talk about landscape, we're really talking about ourselves, because we connect the landscape to our essential selves, to our childhood. You can't take that landscape away because I grew up there. But that's one of the facts of life. You don't own anything. And the other thing that I found in writing the book was, and I find this when I come home too, immigrants come home looking for some kind of resolution about themselves, the past, the present. And oftentimes life does not provide you with a resolution. Fiction does, poetry does, films do. But life itself has a way of saying there doesn't have to be a resolution. In fact, if you find a resolution, you're doing pretty well. But and again, just like home doesn't belong to us, or landscape doesn't, resolution is not something that we should expect.
I mean, it seems to me that even memory is parceled out in different ways. It's apportioned in different ways as well. Even take something as fundamental as the famine, because there has been a really extraordinary, powerful documentary on the famine airing here in Ireland over the last few weeks. And I think many are encountering the famine in its full reality and awfulness for the first time through television. And yet you talk about a conversation with a Choctaw in the United States who can talk to you knowledgeably about the famine and how his tribe had contributed. And it always seemed to me the famine seems to be remembered in a very different way by the Irish in America to the way it is remembered in Ireland. There are so many memorials to the famine in America. Maybe it's the transmitted memory of the survivors, those who experienced famine, survived and emigrated. Whereas until relatively recently, the memorials in Ireland where, again, there's that poem by Van Boland where she talks about the famine road that peters out in the bog and goes nowhere. That these are the memories in the landscape of the famine. But it does occupy a very big role in the way many Irish in America identify themselves, isn't it?
There's a lot of interesting thoughts in what you've just outlined there, because history, which is theoretically anyway the story of our lives, of our country, memory is a very unreliable narrator. And it's influenced by all kinds of things that we like. If a policeman, if there's an accident in the street and a policeman comes along to take notes about what happened, there'll be 4 or 5 different viewpoints on what actually occurred. I find that when it comes to the retelling of the past, I find that I look to my own education in history in Ireland. And there were 2 areas that I remember. One was just dates. The famine happened in 1845 and it went on and the population went down, just dry dates. And the other one is we absorbed history emotionally, and we absorbed it in almost like a drama. The villain was Britain, and we were the victims. And we learned history from the victims' point of view. But having gone to school in England at 11 years of age, I learned that 1% of England's history was Ireland. 99% of our history was England. So there was an imbalance there. So if you get an English writer, even an unbiased historian, say like A.J.P. Taylor, writing about the Irish famine, it's a little suspect because it's the perspective of over there. On the other hand, when it's being written from here, from Ireland, it's also a little suspect. All I do know is that the famine left a gigantic psychic wound in the soul of Ireland. And when a trauma happens, I think the natural reaction, whether it's individual or collective, is to respond to that in many ways. One is silence, the other is shame, the other is forget. And the fact that there are no monuments or memorials are very, very few in Ireland. There are monuments, but they're hidden. And you'll drive along a landscape and somebody who's local will say to you, oh, they're the famine drills over there. Or there's where the workhouse was. But they're not officially remembered. The distance that Irish people got and the identity that they assumed when they went to America allowed them emotion to have a distance and to say, this is where we came out of. This is what brought us to this part of the world, and that has to be memorialized and commemorated. But I do think there's a sense of denial and shame when it comes to the recognition of what actually happened in 1845 and the history from then on. Because there are people who would not pull punches and say that was our Holocaust, and we have denied it. And if you look at how the Jewish people, for example, remembered their Holocaust, we lost millions of people because of that. Now, the events that led to that, how do you interpret them? Do you say that it was a natural calamity that happened because Irish people were dependent solely on the potato? Or do you take a more cynical overview and say that actually there was wheat and corn and food being shipped out under armed guard to the landlords in Britain, and that it may not actually have been such an accident as we are led to believe, that it could actually have been part of a murderous policy towards the people of Ireland, coming from the Elizabethan plantations on. This is the way to deal with them. Who's right? Who's wrong? I don't know, but I do know that I read an article in one of the Irish papers some years ago, and the writer said, let's get off this nonsense about going back to talk about the famine. Surely we're over that and we're better than that, and it's time to move on. Well, no, we're not better than that, and it's not time to move on. It's time actually to move back and look at it and see what the effects of it were emotionally, politically, economically, and spiritually on us as a people. Because when you talk to people over here about the famine, it's a very emotional topic for them. It's not so much over there.
Do we talk past each other sometimes? You know, those of us in Ireland who live here most of the time, and you know, and all of those who identify as Ireland for very, very strong reasons, do we sometimes see the same things through opposite ends of the telescope? You know, that famous phrase by George Bernard Shaw that Ireland and England are divided by a common language. Is there a little bit of that as well when you look at the global Irish and how we understand and see each other?
Yes, I would think so. If you've never left your country, and I think people who haven't left are in a way blessed that they haven't had to leave. Some people, of course, had to leave. Some people wanted to leave. whatever the reason you left, you assume, as I said before, a different identity. When an Irishman leaves Ireland, Ireland becomes tremendously important emotionally to him. Nostalgia, memory, imagination, the yearning to return, all these things swim around in the emigrant's soul. And it's true not just of Irish people, but of any exiled group you want to mention. They will always talk about the same thing, about being displaced, about not belonging in either place. Sometimes the diaspora, for want of a better word, feel that they have this huge connection to Ireland, but there's not a corresponding connection between Ireland and the diaspora. They feel that once they're gone, they're kind of forgotten, except for their family. They don't really matter. They're just an amorphous mass over there, whose daily lives and concerns don't really matter that much to the population who stay. But you'll find the people who leave reading the Irish Times, the Irish Independent, the Leinster Leader, the Connacht Tribune while they're away. There's not the same curiosity about the life of the emigrant in that way. Tom Murphy writes brilliantly about that in Conversations on a Homecoming, for example, where the guy arrives home and everybody's, oh, well, you're welcome. And within 10 or 15 minutes, it's changed. The atmosphere has changed. Ireland becomes tremendously important when you leave it. Somebody said there's nothing as patriotic as an Irishman outside Ireland. The literature, the landscape, the humor, the people, the events, the stories, the gossip, these are the things that are missed. Whereas if you haven't left Ireland, you don't really have a curiosity about the life or the times of the immigrant. And I've found this myself when I've gone home. And I'm not condemning it in any way. I think it's just the way the world is. You arrive home and you've been living somewhere in Bangkok or, New York or whatever, and you come home and you get about 5 minutes to talk about what you've been doing, and then it goes back to Mrs. Dorden's cat. The kind of life that you live, the kind of views that you have, what the experience, hardly anybody ever asks me what that's like. What's it like to live in New York or Los Angeles? There's very little interest. Now, on the other end of the scale, and again, Tom Murphy in Famine writes about this really well. And it goes back to the famine. There is a sense, and this is just my own opinion, there's a sense that if you leave the tribe for whatever reason, it's seen as an abandoning of the tribe. And there's a kind of a resentment built up in that. And you could see it especially in relation to American tourists who came to Ireland. They were the object of ridicule. I don't think there's any more profound search than somebody coming back to look for their roots of where their father, their grandfather, their great-grandfather left. And if it's a tumble of stones in a field somewhere, they stand and they say, my journey began there. And my great-great-grandfather came out of that place. Well, I remember in Dublin, we would make fun of those people in CIE buses with cameras and Burberry overcoats and say, oh, there's the Yanks back looking for their roots. And I really thought about that, and I thought, what is that? And I think it goes back to that sense of denial connected with the famine, and also this idea that if you leave, you've abandoned the tribe, and to abandon the tribe is unforgivable. That may be reading too much Freudian significance into it, but I wonder why it is that the displaced immigrant returning to his home place feels within a short-ish space of time the need to leave again.
That happens so often.
So what I would say is that we should be much more interested in what it means to be living outside Ireland, but we're not. I don't think it's just true of Irish people, as I said. I think it's true of, I speak to Mexicans, I speak to people from Venezuela, Germany, all over the place. They all talk about this common journey that the emigrant must make. And it's not just a physical one. It's an emotional, it's a spiritual one. And I don't mean in a religious way. It's a journey inward that's made as well as outward.
Yeah, we were talking to Colin McCann recently, and he was talking about the writing that he's done on the Middle East, and he spoke about the importance of humility in approaching that which you don't know well, humility and curiosity. And maybe we haven't approached each other collectively across the diaspora with that appropriate degree of humility. But even when you talk about myth, your reference to myth there and to Finn McCool is useful myth, because it tells us something that is essentially true. But you have hilarious references to go back to Walking with Ghosts, to mythology as well. I mean, you talk about going to school, as a young child and learning, not liking maths, but loving the stories about the Fenians. You talk about them running from one end of Ireland to the other, stopping only in Mullingar for the feed of blackberries on the way. Right. And then later on, that translates into, when you go to the Christian Brothers, the way you're taught history, and you're taught about the English, which also is history encoded with myth. And we were both young when the 50th anniversary of 1916 was celebrated in 1966, and then a few years ago when we celebrated the centenary. I think we approached it in a very different way. We approached it with a real curiosity to understand ourselves and the journey we've traveled, or the many journeys we've traveled over the past 100 years. And that has to be so important for us now as we approach the centenary of very divisive events here in Ireland. So some of it is about how you remember, not whether you remember, but how you remember, isn't it?
Oh yes, absolutely. As I was saying about the policeman who comes on the scene of an accident and he asks 4 people what happened, they'll give him 4 different versions of what they truly believe happened. Because history we're taught the facts of history. But the facts of history are overlaid. It's like archaeology. An archaeologist goes down into the ground and he has a toothbrush and a lamp, a small torch, and he's looking for the past in that clay. And if he's lucky enough, he'll come across something that reveals something huge about the past. And that is the way that we have to approach history, with, as you said, a sense of humility and a sense of purpose, and knowing that the truth itself is elusive, but that the journey isn't just found in the first 2 inches. The journey has to go deep and deep and deep until you find the thing that reveals the particular, that reveals the universal.
Well, let's talk about archaeology for a minute, because it wouldn't be the two of us if we weren't. But you touch on it very briefly in the book. But you talk about your years at university. I think you said it was like waiting for a flight in an airport for 4 years, and then you talk about the moment that you got your degree, and the president of the university droning off all the names, and your mother saying, he's just called out your name, go up and get it before he gives it to somebody else.
Yes.
And I did the same thing. I stood on the same steps a few years later to get my degree in archaeology. And it struck me that you still use terms are almost archaeological metaphors for some of the events you describe in the book. Trying to go back to some of the horrific experiences you had as a young man. You talk about them as being like picking away at a piece of concrete with a toothpick, which is almost like an archaeological metaphor. But do you? And in a way, what you're trying to do, I think, what you do in the book, in that Dublin, is you're excavating a Dublin as well and surfacing it and trying to make sense of it that doesn't any longer exist. I mean, there is something there, isn't there? I mean, it is a kind of a training or an approach that you take with you. I would describe myself as a failed archaeologist. I went off and did something completely different, and yet I keep coming back and thinking about it and how it can be useful.
Yes, archaeology is the physical excavation of the ground. I suppose writing is the imaginative investigation of the ground of one's past. And again, going back to that word of humility, you have to approach it with humility, because you think you remember something in a particular way. And the more you think about it, the more you realize that is actually not the full truth. And I have to be humble before this investigation. If you're on a dig on an archaeological site, you can't just go in there with a bulldozer and say, okay, well, whatever comes up here is the truth. You have to be patient, and you have to also, I think, acknowledge that you might not find anything, and that your labor does not have to be rewarded. But what I've found in writing is that there's a quiet place in all of us. It's a place that we don't visit a great deal, but I suppose maybe it's the place that prayer used to bring me to when I was a practicing Catholic. This quiet place where truths are revealed. Maybe people who practice meditation find that they get to that place easier. But I found when I started to think about something, it was almost like a prayer. It was almost like saying, lead me to this place. And when I trusted it, and when I was humble about it, it led me to place. I thought, geez, I'd utterly forgotten that. Oh my God, there's a connection between this and that. Now, what was interesting to me was that when I started to write the book, what I wanted to do was an exercise that we can all do. It's a pretty simple one, which is, how do you trace the spiritual, societal, social, and cultural influences that determined who you become as a man or a woman? What are they? Religion, education, politics, economics, all those things play into the raw material that forms you. And then you look back on it and see how much you are the result of that. But what was interesting to me was I found that in mapping my own journey, I was also mapping in a kind of a way the history of those influences on society from 1950 to 1980. The time when religion and state were very much intertwined, when education was very kind of narrow in its aims. And that surprised me. And the act of writing, whether you publish it or not, is a very revealing thing, because you can articulate verbally what your ideas are, but nothing quite reveals itself as much as taking a pen and a piece of paper and allowing yourself to go to that very, very quiet place where this other voice starts to speak to you. And so that was a gift I didn't know that I was going to be given, was that access. I remember Rory De Valera, who was professor of archaeology at the time when I was there, and his subject of expertise was the passage tombs and how those passage tombs were constructed and how brilliantly they were configured. that the body was buried in a particular place, but you couldn't just walk into the tomb and go straight to it. You had to go through all this labyrinth of passages. And that's the way I feel about getting to the truth of one's life. And when you get to that place, you're then confronted in a memoir as opposed to a novel or an essay. You're confronted with the truth. There it is. Do you tell that truth or do you let it go? What I never wanted to do was I never wanted to make it funnier, more miserable, more romantic, more nostalgic, or more bitter than it actually was. I didn't want to emphasize any, because I could have taken one of those things and said, I'll exaggerate a bit here and turn it into a bit of a funny story that'll give people a laugh. I didn't want to do that. Nor did I want to overlay the experience of the child with the wisdom of the adult. When a child is experiencing the world, it's not drawing conclusions. It's not saying, oh, well, I'm getting boxed on the head because I don't know how many days it took 3 men to dig a hole 6 foot wide when one of the men has, a wooden leg, or whatever the mad question you were being asked to solve was. The truth is in there in all of us. It's how we actually get to it and what we do with it when we get it. And that's true in the historical sense as well, of what we were talking about in relation to the famine.
I mean, to write like that, because it seems to me that every word in this book has been thought about and rolled around and weighed for almost for accuracy. That you've thought long and hard about this. And it's not just about what you're telling, because somehow you've climbed back into the eyes of a child as well. This description about going to school as a young boy and seeing Jesus hanging on the cross in a wet nappy, in a child's terms. Mm-hmm. You've stripped it back from all of the accretions, of decades that follow. But to write like that, you must have been writing for a long, long time and thinking as deeply about the craft of writing as you have about the craft of acting. I mean, how talk a little bit about that, because you all that time you've been an actor. You are a writer, and you have been a writer too.
Well, I think you and I share a tremendous love of literature. And I don't mean that in any pedantic way. It just is something I have always been drawn to, and something I've always respected. I wasn't writing a great deal. I did bits and pieces here and there, but literature has been a constant guide in my life. When I was young, I looked for myself in literature. I was looking to see what, I couldn't find anything or anybody who could put me on the way towards some kind of wisdom. But I looked at literature and I thought, look, Hemingway or Brian Moore or whoever it was, I felt that they were guiding me in some way towards something I didn't really understand. Poetry has always been tremendously important to me, and you're right, I did weigh every word in that. I originally wrote the entire thing in verse, weirdly enough, and the agent who got the first manuscript said, listen, this will sell 2 copies and one of them will be yours. Yeah, you better go back to the drawing board. But it was a good exercise, because poetry to me is like sculpture. A sculptor will tell you that inside the rock is what you want. What you have to do is hammer away at the rock until whatever's in there reveals itself. And poetry is like a big rock, a verbal rock, where you chip off the words that you don't need to reveal what you want. And that's what I tried to do with it, to make it spare, to make it simple, not to dicky it up with, descriptions and things. I wanted it to be real. And those lessons from sculpture and poetry, I think, served me well in the writing of it. But of course, as soon as I'd finished it, I wanted to set fire to it. And, there's something about having completed something. The great difference between, say, film acting and stage acting is that on the stage, when that curtain comes down from the last time, it will never be seen again. It exists only in the memory of the people who have witnessed it. And they remember that experience in a very different way to the way they experience a film. You remember your experience of film in terms of images. You'll rarely hear people say, do you remember that great speech or that great line? There'll be a couple of lines here and there, but what people remember when they recall a film is images. Oh, remember that scene in Ryan's Daughter when Omar Sharif came over on the camel? That's how we remember film. There's a very different experience in theater. You're part of a collection of people. You're an individual, and you receive the information from the stage, intellectually, emotionally, but not so much imagistically. From an actor's point of view, when the curtain goes down for the last time on the set, it's gone. It's gone forever. It'll never be recaptured. Film, fortunately or unfortunately, is there forever. I never want to see a film that I've ever been in. And I've always enjoyed the stage because I never have to watch it. It's gone and done. Whereas with film, it's always there. And it comes at the most unsuspecting times. You'd be sitting on the couch eating a bag of crisps, and the next thing, something comes on that you were in, and you go, Jesus, where's the remote? Where's the remote? That kind of a feeling. And if anybody doesn't believe that, try looking at pictures of yourself when you were 20 and you were in a pair of bell bottoms with hair down to here thinking you were the bee's knees, or if you see videos of yourself, or if you hear your own voice. That's when you hear your own voice on tape. Most people say, oh, geez, I don't sound like that, do I? They look at things of themselves on video and they say, oh, Jesus Christ, look at the size of my ears. Whatever it is they hone in on. So you can't be objective and subjective at the same time. So when it comes to writing, it has the same kind of effect as the film. It's there forever. And, you're glad that you've done it, but you never actually want to see it again. I think having been a film actor for many, many years, and having been a stage actor on and off during those years, my most satisfying memories are the memories of the stage. And my memories of growing up are powerful about the stage and about the world of cinema, because both involve imagination. And without imagination, we're lost. Imagination saved me when I was a child. As I was saying, when my hands would be stinging from getting 6 of the best on each hand, I would stand and look out the window and imagine something happening on the mountain beyond. Even when I was living in New York, 24 stories up in an environment that was utterly alien and hostile to me, I looked out and I would imagine something beyond myself. And to this day, imagination is a form of a huge, easily accessible form of escape for me too.
Is there a sense in which you keep trying almost to make yourself uncomfortable? I mean, by taking on the craft of writing, by trying to tell a story with such ruthless honesty, because although there's great affection for that Ireland that doesn't doesn't exist anymore, and for the people who protected you, and who were close to you when you were a child, you don't rose tint the very harsh world that could be at the time as well. And even the act of leaving Ireland and going to an unknown place, and it was much more unknown when you left than it was for those of us who left in the last 10, 20 years. That's a deeply discomforting experience. And even in acting, I remember when I was in New York, I remember you saying at one point, there's a lot of things I can't do, but I'm not really a singer. And then you did Camelot with the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, and you played King Arthur, where you were in a singing role, pushing yourself constantly into areas where you're testing the ground to see if you can do this, if you can take this on. And it's something I recognize in a way, because if you work as an Irish diplomat, you change job every 4 years. Every 4 years, just when you're climbing on top of what you do and you're the master of it, you move on to something completely different, where you've got to get to know a new set of people, live in a new city, learn how to take the trains in a new city maybe again, work in a new language, and realize that you know nothing, and your kind of forces a humility and a learning on you. Is there a dimension of that to the way you've progressed when you look back on it?
It's interesting what you say about the life of a diplomat. I've often wondered about it. I've known a few diplomats in my life, and it's an interesting observation for me, because, as you say, there's no credit in the bank. What you did in that particular posting doesn't apply here at all. And you have to immerse yourself in a new world and risk failure. And it's a new journey. At the same time, you have to remain, to a certain extent, dispassionate about the job that you're doing. You can't, as a diplomat, say to somebody from, standing and say, "Oh, that's a load of bollocks. We don't believe that at all." You have to find a way to say that with all due respect, Your Excellency. You know what I mean? You have to. The diplomat is an actor. He has to be an actor. He has to be a very good actor. And politicians have to be very good actors. I mean, if you think about Reagan, going back to the idea of myth, Reagan was a myth. A total myth, an empty vessel in which there was nothing inside, but who managed to convince an entire country that he was a heroic presidential figure. He caused enormous damage in America, and the effects are still being felt from him today. But when I look at politicians, and when I look at world politicians on the stage, what fascinates me about them is the amount of acting that's involved. And to be a diplomat requires a degree of acting that I think most of them are unaware of. Because acting isn't about becoming another person. You cannot become another person. You manipulate and conceal and reveal what it is that you want from this little, center of yourself. And you're thinking and you're reacting. That's what you're doing, reacting to the situation. And so, in my experience of watching politicians and diplomats, amongst many other professions, but in those ones which are about the public perception of one's identity, there's a great deal going on in the head when that's happening. When that mask, as Eugene O'Neill talks about, when that mask slips, we go, "Oh my God!" For example, when George Brown, was it George Brown? Gordon Brown, sorry. Do you remember when he got into that car after he had been meeting and greeting, and this woman said, "Oh, you're an awful man altogether," and oh, what about? And he gets into the car and he says, "Oh, I'll attend to that. You're absolutely right." And he gets into the car, and his mic is still on, and you hear him say to his aide-de-camp or whatever, "A bloody woman," and you think, "Oh my God, well, that's what he really felt." But when you cut back to what he was doing, he was acting. So when I look at Obama and I look at Clinton and I look at Reagan, Reagan's great gift was that he could act sincerity. He was utterly insincere, but he could act sincerity brilliantly. And they all have an acting persona. And when they are revealed to you in persona, in person, you see a very different. And that's what acting is. And Camus was the one who said, we all act all the time. And I recounted in the book how that director said, when I got this present from somebody on the set one day, and I said, "Oh, thank you very much. That's really nice." He said, "Oh, don't believe him. He's an actor. He doesn't mean it." And it infuriated me because the actor's job is to tell the truth. That's what his real job is. If you were on stage working, doing a Eugene O'Neill play, you are channeling the work of Eugene O'Neill for an audience. You're not lying. There are people who are 1,000 times better actors than all the actors that I know put together. If you live in a village and you walk out the door and you see Mrs. Smith coming down the road and you think, "Oh, Jesus, not this one. Oh, no." And she comes up to you and you say, "Mrs. Smith, how are you? And how does everyone belong to you?" And you're oh, Lord, no, he did. Oh, God, you're hilarious. Doing that. That's acting. And so, to me, the world of the diplomat was always a romantic one. He's a French diplomat. He's a British diplomat. It was the world of Graham Greene, and and then Irish diplomats had their own particular romantic aura about them. And they were fascinating creatures to me because I always wanted to know who's the real person behind that persona. And it was very interesting the way people reacted to diplomats. Oh, he's a diplomat. People would rarely react to a diplomat by saying, "Ah, Jesus, the herd. How's it going?" There's a certain ritual that surrounds the interaction between the diplomat and the public, which I kind of find fascinating. But I met Reagan, I met Obama, I met Clinton, I met Bush, I met the Queen, and I met Prince Charles, and I met Diana. I met all of those people. And I met them in private moments, just in those glimpses, I saw there's the real person in there. That's not who we think is the real person. And it gives you an understanding that there's a private individual in there. And that contrast between the private and the public is fascinating. What Brian Friel did so brilliantly in Philadelphia, Here I Come, private gar, public gar.
I was thinking of someone who started life as a diplomat but became a writer, and a really great writer, and probably, if anything, greatly underrated too. John le Carré, who died this week too, and you're talking about how clear-sighted the way you've turned into the past here, and stared at it crisply. There's nothing fuzzy about that portrait of the past. And John le Carré, in a recent interview, spoke about nostalgia, and he spoke about the great onset of nostalgia that's taken over in so many places at the moment, and how nostalgia can be it can be a profoundly dangerous thing, which can also be weaponized politically. You know, it's the yearning for a reality that never existed, and the belief that that can in some way be recreated. And it seems to me that that's a real danger in public life now, and something that we need to guard very strongly against. That's my sense in any event.
I agree. Now, and I think it's a recurring characteristic of fascism, this appeal to a world, a bygone world of greatness that never really existed. We must get that back again. We must even Joe Biden is not saying, you know, let's look to the issues of the future. He's saying, let's go back to the way it was before Trump. That's dangerous too, because the way it was before Trump is what led to Trump, I would say, arguably. Nostalgia, as you're so absolutely right. I mean, Mussolini used the idea of ancient Rome as an impetus for, you know, his appeal to the Italian people. Hitler, Stalin, all these guys, Trump, this desire to return. And also on an individual level, I think nostalgia is dangerous because we can say, oh, things were better then, things were wonderful then. Well, you know what? People hit Dublin in the rare old times. That is not true. That song, much as I like the song, it's actually a dangerous sentiment. When I was growing up in Ireland, it was not a safe place to be a child. Yes, it was idyllic in some ways, but it wasn't a safe place. And when we were educated, and this is something that it's a theme that runs through the book, is the question of identity. Because when you're a child, your identity is being built. And what I found was that as a child, I wasn't encouraged to build my own identity. I was encouraged to adopt the identity that was laid out for me. And one size fits all. Everybody had to have the same. So when I came to realize that that identity didn't fit me anymore, and I didn't want it to be, I had to then reconstruct my own version of myself, of an identity, and nostalgia played a part in that. And then I woke up one day and I realized I don't have time for nostalgia anymore. I have to live in the present. Nostalgia and guilt and regret are meaningless things. Done, finished, move on. The world is not the way you'd like to remember it, because nostalgia can be a very sedating escape from the reality of the world. And if you know how to manipulate the collective consciousness, you can appeal to that. And I think that propaganda does that really, really well. And it wasn't great 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago. No, it wasn't. We had the worst slums in Europe 50 years ago.
Edna O'Brien is celebrating her 90th birthday this month. And she said, she gave a wonderful interview this week where she said, you know, as she has passed every milestone and as she's published every book, she's always said to herself, let there be one more book, one more. There is a writer, the urge to do more, to go further, to say something new has remained undimmed. So now, as she passes her 90th birthday, she's saying, you know, her great wish now is to produce yet one more book. She just published one. Is there another book in you? Do you feel the same way?
I'd love to, about Edna. I went to see her in London a few months ago. And when she talked about that last novel that she wants to write, her eyes lit up. And she started to recount what the novel was going to be about. And this is a woman who's been very ill for the last year or so, the last couple of years. Edna O'Brien is a true artist. I mean, she has dedicated her life to her art. And of course, it's going to be about one more. And what's admirable about her is the way she has pushed herself and gone through the disapproval and you know, basically hunted out of Ireland, her books burned, to this place now where she's adored and revered. But she was one of the people that was responsible for the construction of the New Ireland, in my opinion. People like her and John McGahern. She is truly a great artist, and I think her sense of what it means to be of use artistically in the world is inspiring. What you've done doesn't matter, really. It's what you're doing now that matters. And I'm toying with a novel at the moment that I'm enjoying, and it's about a lot of the things that we've talked about. It's about home. It's about what home means. From the point of view of exile, and yeah. So, and thank you for saying, you know, all the things that you've said, because these things are important to me. Because even if I wasn't writing or acting or doing any of these things, I think it's tremendously important in life to challenge ourselves and to push ourselves and not to fall into routines and not to fall into old ways of thinking and thinking, well, that's the way it is now, and I've always believed that, and you know, you can't change my mind about that kind of thing. To listen, to be open, to be curious, to change your stance, to move into something else, to try to do something. Even somebody said to me one day, try writing with your left hand for 3 weeks. And I said, okay, I'll try doing that. And it was not easy. But forcing yourself to do things that are different, because then you find out new things about yourself. Just like what we referred to earlier on about finding that quiet place and going down deep into yourself to find out who you really are. The book that I've written is also about who am I? Who am I and where am I going? These are the two most important questions you can ask. Socrates, Plato, whatever great poetry, they all come down to this question: who am I? And how much do I know about myself? And just like you were saying about starting another diplomatic post, that's kind of the way I feel about life too. Push yourself, learn something new, go into an uncomfortable situation, and be humble before it all, because you don't really know anything, not really.
Well, that's a note of humility to end this discussion on, and I suppose after a year of turbulence and disruption, I hope we each find a quiet place over Christmas. I hope we all do. That we harness some of that spirit that you've been speaking about for what lies ahead next year. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you again and to meet and take time together again. It's been too long, and I hope it won't be too long before we do it again. No. Whether we meet in Maine or even better in Dublin, it'll be great to see you.
In Dublin, in your diplomatic. In your diplomatic persona, and then that'll drop after 2 minutes, and then you'll be saying, "Oh Jesus, how is it going? Get up the yard, you bollocks!"
Don't give away any secrets.
Okay, Neil. Okay, great talk, man. Bye bye.
Bye bye.